Ladies and gentlemen, liebe Gäste, my name is Uwe Rau. I'm the director of the Goethe-Institut, Toronto. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming you for another talk, this time about the Hemsbach Protocol, a new cultural approach to integrating refugees in Germany and Europe. The refugee crisis and Germany's role in dealing with it is part of the daily news coverage also here in Canada. We, as Germany's cultural institution, thought that it is worthwhile to explore not only the political implications, but the specific cultural dimensions of this issue. So this event has been organized on rather short notice. I'm really grateful to our guests this evening, and also to my colleague Jutta Brendemühl for putting everything together. A couple of days ago, the president of the Goethe-Institut, Professor Klaus-Dieter Lehmann, wrote a remarkable article in the newspaper Berlin Tagesspiegel. And to set the mood for this evening, I thought I would like to quote some of his thoughts. Quote, "We are presently experiencing an impressive culture of welcome that is making a lasting impact on the image of Germany in the world. Yet welcoming refugees is only a start. What is decisive will be how soon the people are given access to society, how their living and employment prospects can be developed. The word refugees suggests that it is a homogeneous group, but it is the opposite. Each refugee has their own personal biography, own experiences and abilities, which determine their expectations. Certainly, they will all first take a deep breath at having escaped the life-threatening regions of crisis and war and arriving in safety. But after 6 months, at the very latest, questions about the future will become more urgent, not just about oneself, but about the family as well. The Goethe-Institut is familiar with situations from the countries of origin. It observes the refugee problem in the neighboring countries of Syria and Iraq, in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, where the numbers of refugees sometimes make up as much as 30% of the original population. As an international active organization, in 2013, the Goethe-Institut united with refugee organizations in the camps of the Middle East and Turkey to begin creating art and educational projects that give children and young adults in particular meaningful activities, help them process what they have experienced and develop creative alternatives. Art against war may sound naive, yet otherwise there is no hope, but only resignation or escape. Investing in cultural activities and education is worthwhile. It may not be a panacea, but not doing this creative work would mean giving up on the people. Language is the key to integration, to taking part in social life in Germany, to beginning studies or integrating in the labor market. Ample and differentiated programs for learning German are therefore of central importance. We must not forget that in spite of the acute stress and the necessary demands for integration in Germany, not all people are nomads. For this reason, the Goethe-Institut is intensively working on anti-destabilization measures for these societies. In eroding societies, stakeholders in education can form the heart with whom we establish learning communities, build and expand the cultural infrastructure, and create local opportunities. There are good examples of this in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and in Tunisia, not training people for migration, but for their own countries. End of the very long quote. With Germany facing a possible influx of up to 1.5 million people in the current refugee crisis, there are mixed messages sent to the world. On one hand, we could notice an almost hysterical so-called culture of welcoming of well-meaning German citizens. On the other hand, the volume of critical voices, particularly from mayors and politicians on the community level, is rising because of the feeling of being totally overwhelmed and exhaustion. And there are these ugly pictures from right-wing activists who express xenophobia in well-attended manifestations or by destroying accommodation facilities. Jutta Brendemühl will now introduce our guests. I'm looking really forward to an exciting and insightful evening. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Dankeschön.
Let me just briefly tell you a bit more about these three men we find up here, three Canadians that we invited to talk about the German and European refugee crisis, and for good reason. Darren O'Donnell himself can attest to the impact of both the Goethe-Institut's international cultural work as well as our language classes. We've sent him on an artistic research trip a few years ago to Germany, and he then was a student here in those classes right behind you. And as a Canadian arts worker, I have to say, unfortunately, we kind of lost him to Germany, and he went there to do a couple of amazing projects. One was a brilliant project with mostly immigrant youth, German kids of the first big waves of Turkish descent and Balkan descent in the prestigious Ruhr-Triennale. And this is just a backdrop to what we will be talking about tonight. If you don't have it in your bookshelf, I do, but I left it exactly there this morning. Do get Darren's now 10-year-old, nearly 10-year-old, a book, but still very seminal essay called Social Acupuncture. And der Name ist Programm, as we say in German. It already gives you an idea about some of his approaches. Darren himself has described his artistic practice as something as close to hanging out as you can come and still charge admission. This is his approach to theater. And we'll see him marrying that in a more serious and very powerful way to marry this notion of civic engagement and social interaction as an aesthetic, as performance, as art. And that's important to us here, of course, in this latest project presented, the Hemsbach Protocol will go out in a minute. I'm really glad that Darren decided to bring along his colleague, Tendon Chosen, who is also part of this creature called Mammalian Diving Reflex, and that's important, of course, because Darren is not just Darren, he works collaboratively, especially with youth and also with youth here. And we just briefly had a chat, and it would be interesting to hear your perspective, Chosen. Who went to Germany twice with Darren, and who himself has, I think we've established that, there was third-generation refugee of Tibetan descent living in Canada. So you have that in your own voice and your background as well. And Darren and Chosen will present the Hemsbach Protocol, and then we will hand over to Doug Saunders. It's a pleasure to have you back at the Goethe, Doug, to respond and discuss. Doug is the Globe and Mail's international affairs columnist. We're Twitter buddies and constantly tweeting and retweeting. He's also the former European bureau chief and has previously spent a lot of time in Germany. He's also just back from Germany. I just 10 minutes ago got the debriefing on that. This will be really interesting on what you just did there on the refugee crisis and discussions with mayors, as we will just hint at. Once you're in a bookstore to get Darren's book, don't forget to get this. This is also background to what we're talking about tonight, in a way. Arrival City is Doug Saunders', was that your first book? It was the first major book that is a tour de force analysis of the global rise of urban immigrant enclaves. And it was followed by the myth of the Muslim tide, which examines the effects of immigration from Islamic countries to the West, and both, of course, are absolutely current.
Also published under the title Mythos über Fremde.
Exactly. I looked it up on Amazon.de today, and of course both books are out in Germany for good reason, because all of this is one big cultural circle that we'll be talking about today. And Darren will start by presenting what this ominous project is that he's currently developing in Germany with refugees. And then Doug will take over, we'll just have a discussion and involve all of you, because I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions and different opinions. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So this is Daryl. Daryl triggering the slideshow. So we'll just roll slides. I won't. They'll be clear as to what's happening in the slides as we go on describing, but I'll just let them roll in the background. So thanks a lot, Jutta and Goethe, for this opportunity. It's really exciting, and I just want to say how happy I am to be doing this with both Chosen and with Doug. Doug's book is amazing. I highly recommend it, and it's very much, I think, in line with the way that we're thinking about this particular task that we're up to here. So, and that again become clear. But one of the things I'm quite happy about is we're developing this project It's a hard project that we're developing, so partly I'm looking forward to responses from Doug that are helpful. We need help. I think everybody there needs a lot of help, and so help from everybody would be appreciated, information about what we're trying to do and any kind of insights you have. So I just wanted to sort of say that to begin with. And that what we're doing is fairly utopian, so it's a little bit unrealistic and maybe naive. So if some people can ground us in reality, that would be helpful. So what we'll do is we'll talk about who we are and what we do. What is the Hemsbach Protocol, really briefly. We went there and lived in a refugee holding facility. We'll talk about what that was like, and what we discovered there, and what we're planning next for this. So that'll be a quick 20 minutes that we'll just zip through all of that. So we're a performing arts company called Mammalian Diving Reflex. We make stage-based works. We also do sort of the interventions that you might find at an event like Nuit Blanche. Some of our stage-based work is All the Sex I've Ever Had, where we work with a crew of seniors. We interview them about every single year of their life and all the sex that they can possibly remember, and then we turn that into a script, throw them on stage, and they perform this show. We've been doing this all over the world. We're about to do it in Sydney, at the Sydney Festival at the Sydney Opera House, and we did it here at Luminato. We also work on the opposite end of the spectrum. We have a project called Haircuts by Children, where we work with a bunch of little kids, get them trained as hairstylists, rent salons, pay them to work in the salon, and the kids do crazy haircuts on people, and we call that performance art. So it's a range of things, and some of them are stage-based, some of them are interventions, some of them will be interventions into the whole dynamic of a festival. This now is an intervention into the dynamic of a town. And we'll pass by some of those photographs. You'll see the aerial photograph of the town. It's called Hemsbach. It's about 11,000 people, and 10,000 of those are German-born, 1,000 are foreign people, and just last November, it was imposed upon them that they had to accept about 100 refugees. 80? In that? 80, yeah. And so they now have this building called Luisenhof, which is a former senior home, or actually it was a former hotel, now senior home, then senior home, now refugee holding facility. And so they've got these guys in there, and there's a bunch of men from Gambia, maybe about 30 from Gambia, and those are mostly single men between, say, 20 years and 18 and 30. And then there's families from the Balkans. There's nobody from any kind of area that Germany considers a crisis area. It's not. There's nobody from any war. They're sort of pejoratively described as economic migrants, and so they're in this place. We did a site visit last year as part of a wider project by the Cultural Office of the Metropolitan Region of Rhine-Neckar, which is bringing in artists to work in this area, which is a sort of an area where there's three states. So there's Baden-Württemberg is the state that we're in. I don't know the other two states, but it's this complicated political area where there's Heidelberg, Mannheim. Those are the sort of major cities there, but the whole area it's as if we have three provinces together. So there's a bunch of different governments sort of dealing with this, but there's one sort of administrative office that handles sports, culture, coordinating, business conventions and things like that. And rather than do what they might traditionally do, which is promote culture in the region, the guy who's running this office actually wants to make culture. He's a former theater producer, so he's bringing in socially based artists and sort of dropping them in different areas to see what they'll do. And so our proposal was to come work with these guys and try to answer the question of how do we find employment for them, regardless of their likelihood of staying here. What can we do to build up their networks, their social networks, their employment networks, their understanding of the area, their cultural understanding of Germany? How can we get the Germans to understand what's going on with these guys, what their needs are, and how can we bring these people together? We decided to do that because the people in Hemsbach in particular, which is one of the many places I did as a site visit to see, would this be an interesting place, what should we do here? The interesting thing about them was how serious they were about doing this very, very well, integrating very, very well. So the mayor, who's a former social worker, his name's Jürgen Kirschner, he sort of handed this brief to Thomas Poole, who's like the chief of regulations, so parking, building heights, those kinds of things. So he's the sort of chief of the civil police, of the civil regulatory sort of office. And so he's taken this portfolio and put together, done a bunch of stuff, like put together a group of citizens called BIP, which the I stands for integration. And so he's basically assigned individuals to everybody. So everybody in Luisenhof, this building that's housing these people, everybody has somebody that they consider a mother or a family member that's in the community, and there's quite a bit of generosity coming from those people. So I was a little bit struck by that and decided that I wanted to get involved in this process and wanted to be involved to see what we could do with the question of jobs, because that was the one thing that nobody seemed to be able to pay attention to, and that seems to be a gap, particularly, yeah, it seems to be a gap anyway between the next level of services that are available for employment are not appropriate for people who are living in a refugee state, particularly from countries like Gambia, where there's not a lot of skills. The guys don't have a lot of skills coming from there. So anyway, so we got there and we spent a month. So we can just talk about what that was like. So now I'll slow down a bit and just describe what we saw when we got there, what the experience was like, what we did, and then what we're planning to do. So the place itself, as we're passing by a few slides there, it's quite dorm-like. It's a former hotel, so the rooms are quite small, and they've packed a lot of people in the rooms. The room that I was staying in initially had room for, or it was like had a bathroom in it, and then I don't even know how you describe it. If you look at it, we'll pass by it through here. It's a sort of, there's an arch, and you can see him standing there, I think without his shirt on, and then there's a woman in there. Oh, I think we're stalled there. Oh, it's not repeating. Anyway, so, and it's dorm style. We were living on a floor that was exclusively Gambian, and then on the other floors in larger rooms, there's larger families from Macedonia. And it was a bit startling. It's because there's nobody there really to take care of the place in a kind of official capacity. The resources aren't there. I think there's some of the refugees who are paid, it's called a Euro job, where they're paid something like €1 an hour to do sort of basic cleaning up. It was a bit of a shock. I mean, how did you feel coming there?
I mean, like, overall experience was just like crazy for me, but then again, like, it was sort of like, I guess, what do you call that? Fading point toward my integration to university. So, like, I don't know, like,
he just started in university. He started at Laurier, so you're living in a dorm now.
Yeah, I'm living in a dorm right now. So when I compared these two, it's how should I say this? It's
ridiculously similar.
Yeah, it's ridiculously similar, but it's just like like what they do is a bit different. So like in Luisenhof, like there isn't much to spend on. They don't have much money, so everything feels. I guess everyone feels much more family-like, and then like together, and everyone has their own role of like so I guess like cooking, cleaning, and then I don't know, like there's sort of like a hierarchy over there that I felt. In university, it's very different. Like everyone's in their own room studying, or everyone together partying. I don't know.
So there was this huge vibe of familialness that was kind of interesting, and it definitely, like, we're in this thing together, and that seemed to be something that was quite provisional. It was there and could disappear quite quickly if things got a little bit stressed. There was fights between people that were kind of alarming and surprising that would happen. Understandably, people are in this very stressful situation, and kind of one of the most interesting things that I found was that the people who we were dealing with, and basically we were there to do a month of, okay, how can we come back and get involved in this question of finding these guys jobs. So it was a month of taking a look at that question, and the thing that was sort of striking was the lack of answers, or the lack of even understanding about how that might occur, even from people in relatively well-positioned places of power. Within the town administration itself, they didn't really know what was going on. Even within a sort of general process of when these guys would get processed, they've all made their first application. Some of them came to Italy to do that, and they're still being processed, and now they have to do an interview, and they're still waiting for that interview. There was a lot of confusion about what that was supposed to look like.
It was also really weird, like even some of the refugees like really didn't know the process clearly. So, and then like they don't know like what's gonna happen next.
Well, that's what I'm saying is that even the mayor doesn't know what that process is exactly going to be like, and they're sort of constantly surprised by the shifting landscape. So what we did when we were there primarily is focus on the town itself, the residents of the town, and introduced ourselves to every single business there that had a presence on the street. So if you've seen if we passed by, you've seen the aerial shots of Hemsbach, you can see it's a small place. We were there for 3 weeks, so that was enough time to do that. So we knocked on everybody door to door to just create a database of all of the businesses in the area, introduced ourselves, what we're trying to do, what our basic sort of research question is, and just met everybody. In that period, we socialized a lot with the guys, swam a lot. You can see that there's a lake there. Basically, wanted to sort of get to understand their situation so that we could respond to it as intelligently as possible. Getting information about what the hell's going on is really, really difficult. Language is a challenge. English was what we used all the time. And that was really, really tough. Misunderstandings occurred often over the smallest things about what we were to do next. Or there was an interesting story where another one of these art projects, which was a film version that they were shooting, the Nature Theater of Oklahoma, a Berlin and New York company was shooting a version of the Nibelungen, and one of the refugees was involved in it, this guy from Cape Verde, and they came once to pick him up, and there was and they ended up bringing the wrong guy, because just the level of communication, everybody knows a little bit about everybody else's story, so this guy seemed to know about this Nibelungen thing, they put him in a car, they brought him all the way to Mannheim, he was the wrong guy. So kind of absurd confusions like that happen all the time in this situation because it's very, very confusing. So that's going on, lots of confusion, nobody really knowing what's up next. And just the confusion as to how we can help. And the initial project that now has been changed was what we would do was from February 2016 to September 2017, we would create creative encounters between the citizens of Hemsbach and the people living, we call them the Luisenhofers, the people living in Luisenhof, to create some creative encounters between them over the course of 7 months, document the shit out of them, photograph them, video them, document them like crazy, and then present this process of working with these guys to answer this question: how can we find jobs for you, for the refugees? How do we just document the asking of this question and the response we got from whoever would talk to us in Hemsbach? That's the sort of initial idea, and then we would present this as a stage presentation at a theater in Ludwigshafen, which is near Mannheim. So that's the idea we came in. That's a very complicated idea for a bunch of reasons, is what we discovered, just the impenetrability of people's lives, and to try to figure out who will want to do these kinds of events with us. So what we're doing now, and I'll just sort of wrap up with that, and then we can open this up for questions and comments, and particularly this question of if there's any kind of insights into how do you find people jobs. Our thinking is it has to be a kind of multi-pronged strategy that includes an integration into Germany that is across the board, from cultural, social, to economic, to employment integration. So we're doing this, proposed to do this very sort of strange series that might take a bit to wrap your heads around so that it might make sense to you. But what we want to do is work with these guys to create a small event production team, and over the course of February until August, we will work to simply throw events in Hemsbach that we are going to try to make cool and try to make a kind of funky scene in this weird small town, which is a bedroom community of all of these sort of big industrial cities, to make this thing happen where we do a dance party performance charrette. So a charrette is a design concept where you bring a bunch of people, stakeholders together to answer a particular question, usually around urban planning or architectural concerns. This is about sort of social architecture. How do we find people jobs? So what we want to do is do dance parties because everybody enjoyed partying. That was one of our findings. Everybody enjoyed parties. One of the things that we concluded as a test, we had a cooking contest where we created teams between the people of Hemsbach and the refugees, so these multiculti teams, and then we gave them this bunch of mysterious ingredients that came from Africa and Macedonia and Russia and Syria. We brought them all, and they had to work together blind without knowing what these ingredients were, except that everybody knew what that root was who came from Gambia, so that they could tell the Macedonian person how to deal with that. And so we had these cooking teams, and it proved to be a lot of fun. There was a high amount of uptake with engaging in this sort of thing, and a lot of people came that were just sort of citizens curious about what we were doing. So we want to have a series of these dance parties because there's a lot of interest in dancing, a lot of interest in having just social fun. These guys are bored and alone a lot of the time. And while we're doing that, we'll also bring in experts from the region, try to find employment experts, academics who understand the lay of the land. They will present, that'll be the performance aspect of these series of dance parties that we'll have monthly in Hemsbach. So we'll import these guys from nearby Hemsbach, or sorry, Mannheim, Heidelberg. There's enough universities there that we can have somebody who's got some insights to bring to the page, or whoever we find. It doesn't have to be universities, but maybe some activists that are working with immigration, have special guests at these. And while we're doing this, we're also introducing the community of people who live at Luisenhof, so people get to know them, get to dance with them, get to become friends with them, get to understand what their skills are, what their needs are, and pose to everybody this question and have moments of brainstorming in between also actual serious meetings that we will have with whoever's interested. As we do that, we accumulate kind of what will be the final presentation, which will be, again, a dance party at this, at Volksbau, which is this theater in Ludwigshafen, the State Theater in Ludwigshafen, which is in Mannheim. And so all working toward that. Ideally, the final, the final piece, and I'll finish, is that the other goal that this track is on is to try to start a bar. To try to start a bar in Hemsbach that is a bar that will be staffed by this crew of guys. We use this process of event planning as a training zone for them so that they can all start to figure out basic stuff like budgeting, logistics, strategic thinking, just basic business stuff, and see if we can leave behind a bar or at least a production team that we as Mammalian might work with again. And just to finish, that model is based on a model that we have developed in Parkdale with a bunch of teenagers. Well, and Chosen is one of those guys. We've been working with him and some of his friends, sort of him and a wider group of kids since 2005. Chosen and a very tight crew since 2010 when he was 14 years old. And so we've trained them in the same sort of event production skills because those are so easily transferable. Budgeting, logistics, planning, those can be applied to your wedding, they can be applied to anything. So giving them skills that are transferable. So we're doing that there, and we're also testing out the same model in London with the London International Festival of Theatre, where we're working in Tottenham there, which is another, what Doug would call an arrival city. And again, it's the same idea. We're working with a bunch of kids, and we're a bunch of young kids who are mostly the children of immigrants, if not immigrants themselves, and we're basically introducing them to the cultural industries. We're doing it sort of in a more wide lens, the cultural industries of London, and sort of training them for positions in that if they're interested. The Toronto plan is to train these guys to take over our company to the degree that they're interested in, or assume whatever roles in the cultural industries they find interesting. So we're wondering, can the same model be applied in Germany with these guys? The big impediment probably is that most of these guys will be deported. So we're hoping to do this quickly so that we can share whatever skills we can in this time, get them connected really intimately with networks through things like dancing together and in environments that are kind of flirty and fun and where there's a bit of alcohol and we're developing friendships, not just at a sort of dry, job fair or something like that. So, but also the job fair component will be hopefully part of it, and it will all feel like a big performance party, and that we want to leave behind again this legacy of this production team, if anybody sticks around and can continue with us. We know some will stick around because the people of Hemsbach are going to great lengths, including adoption. We know some cases where people are being adopted. The Gambian guy was adopted by a German family, so people will be around and we might be able to actually do this. But it's a big question. It's it could go in any direction. At this point, we just want to make a bunch of parties where we work with locals, work with Luisenhofers to see sort of what happens. So, yeah, that's that.
Let me try to take you back a few paces, so that we can take a look at what Darren and Chosen are doing in the much wider context of what's happening in Germany with refugees and migrants coming in, and with the very unusual municipal circumstances of settlement of those refugees and migrants. And before I paint that picture, let me just, as an aside, point out how unweird the type of cultural work you're doing is in the German policy context.
Really interesting.
Today. The idea of using freaky artists as part of the of very serious policy initiatives, like the integration of migrants from war zones, is surprisingly unexotic an idea right now. This inclusion of artistic initiatives into the policy process is something I'm seeing in a lot of places. I've been doing a lot of work recently in the Rhine-Main region, super region, which is sort of the heartland of the German economic boom right now. And although I haven't been to Hemsbach, I've been to some towns a lot like it around the region. I mean, for example, I did a big. I'm doing, as I'll explain later, I'm doing a bunch of work with the World Bank on the obstacles to integration of urban labor migrants, this is a big part of it. I was doing consultation with the planner for Frankfurt and the municipal officials for the wider Rhine-Main region, and when we would do big presentations of the ideas that we were finding and coming up with, or when I give speeches and so on, they would make it part of the policy to have a street cartoonist on the side of the stage doing live caricatures and schematic art representations of the metaphors being used in the language around them and that sort of thing. I mean, that type of incorporation of the artistic into the policy is a very interesting thing right now, and I've seen it in some unusual places. Anyway,
do you think it's out of desperation, or
no? I think it's just an understanding in municipal authorities that this can help.
Right,
that there's a role of. I mean, I went to one thing where there were a bunch of policy presentations, and someone did interpretive poetry based on it afterwards, which was, at least in concept, successful. I don't know if in actual execution it was, but that's one of the things about art. Art is a lot like policy in that way, I think, actually. And it's very interesting the way you're combining something that actually is what a lot of agencies are struggling to do, which is to connect migrants to, essentially to take the giant black hole in the German economy, which is the enormous labor shortage and need for new workers, with this influx of people, and try to link them together. As we know, migration flows and labor shortages don't always link up perfectly. So let me step back and try to describe the situation that you're looking at. There is, as we know, a large movement of migrants across the Mediterranean and also across Eastern Europe into Western Europe and particularly into Germany right now. A lot of them through the southern Mediterranean, through the boat routes that became popular in around 2002, 2003, and then died off for 10 years. But also the foot routes across the Baltics and a number of other routes. And the Syrians are the most popular group, the most well-known group in this, probably about half, sometimes less than half of the migrants are Syrian or are affected by the Syrian conflict, but there are a lot of other people. There are Afghans, there are sub-Saharan Africans who used to be part of a seasonal movement of migrants back and forth, but because those seasonal visas are gone, are now stuck becoming permanent. Migrants of questionable documentation. There are a lot of people who were accepted as legal refugees under the 1951 United Nations Convention by one European country, often Italy, when they arrived in the island of Lampedusa. But because the European Union has failed to create it, and even though there's free movement of people throughout the European Union, you can live and work. If you're a citizen of one country, you can live and work in any of the other 27 countries as if you were a citizen. If you're accepted as a refugee in one country, you're not accepted in any of the other countries unless you apply separately and explicitly under what's known as the Dublin Protocol, which means you have a lot of people who are accepted in Italy where nobody's ever going to hire any migrant, even if they do have labor shortages, who then go to the big cities of Germany, particularly in the Rhineland, and they know there's work, they know there's networks of people from the same place they came from, but of course they're not accepted as refugees, so they can't legally work, and they're stuck in this limbo state. They end up living in churches and shelters. That sounds like a lot of the people that you are encountering. But the big phenomenon that's happening, of course, is that this flood of people has been met in Germany and really nowhere else in Europe with this welcome culture, which still is quite a thing. Of course, there's a countervailing unwelcome culture that you see much more in Brandenburg and Saxony, in the East. The places where there is no economy, you get a much more hostile approach. And of course, the German coalition government has decided, both governing parties, at least at the leadership level, have decided that the response to this should be to accept and settle a large number of refugees, while trying to pressure the other countries of the European Union to take their own share, and so on. And there's it's a surprising reaction. I mean, when I started covering Germany regularly more than a decade ago, the phrase, "we are not a country of immigration," was something that had to be uttered by every politician of every party as soon as taking office. And there was officially no immigration, and the idea that there could be was unmentionable, unacceptable. Now we have a CDU chancellor saying that we should take 1.5 million people and settle a large percentage of them. So why is that happening? A couple reasons. First of all, I think out of a national morality, out of a memory that in 1945, the largest refugee crisis in the history of the world was Europeans, and mainly Germans, who had even worse situations in shelters and so on. You can see that. The second big refugee crisis that Germany faced, which was in the 1990s, with the Balkan refugees, which was still a much larger crisis than the one now, although this one might get to be that big, was handled badly. There was a panic. There's a belief that the Bosnians and Kosovars were going to overwhelm Germany, and that there's even a slight rewriting of the Constitution to reduce the guarantees of citizenship and that sort of thing. And of course, that ended. The period between sort of 2004 and 2011, there were basically no refugees going into Germany or Western Europe. It was the lowest level of refugee movement in recorded history. And then this popped up again after 2011. So first of all, a sense of responsibility. Refugees are not immigrants. They are a UN obligation. They are a humanitarian obligation, and so on. But also a pragmatic sensibility, because of course there's a serious problem in Germany. Its economy is overheated. There are huge labor shortages. Probably, a couple million people short of enough working age people in the population. Both of the governing parties have spent a lot of time studying the immigration systems of Canada and Australia and so on to figure out how to use immigration to fill labor shortages. They've been doing things like policies finally to introduce all-day schooling in many of the Länders so that women can enter the workforce. policies to allow you to work after you're 65 and still collect your full pension. They figured that'll add a couple million people to the workforce, but they're still about, even with all of those policies at full tilt, there's still several million people short of having enough working age people. And they were a little disappointed in the big cities of the Rhineland that, that during the economic crisis, not as many Spaniards and Italians and Greeks migrated to their region as they'd hoped. And those who did tended to move back. So that didn't quite fill the shortages as much as they thought. So there's a large sense that the refugees can somehow square the circle and become a solution to the labor shortages, to the demographic problem, to the tax base problem. You have a high dependency ratio emerging where you have a lot of people who are of the age where you're receiving government money, and not a lot of people in the population, not enough people of the age where you're paying into the tax system. And now you get the mayors of the big cities starting to respond to the refugee crisis by saying, oh, this could be a solution to my problem. The mayor of Leipzig in Saxony, he told me he wants to settle maybe 100,000 refugees in Leipzig, because of course famously it was the great shrinking city. It went from 700,000 people down to 400,000 after reunification and war, also all the crises that affected it. It's now back up to 500,000 and is a big manufacturing city, but they would like to get it back up to its full population. And there's a belief that, okay, we can settle these people. The mayor of Frankfurt would like to settle a very large number of refugees in order to fill labor shortages and to fill this tax problem. There aren't enough taxpayers. So you have a very optimistic view among many municipal populations. And of course you have this distinctly German way of settling refugees. I mean, in Canada, refugees are settled mainly by being sponsored by families in particular locations. Those families that sponsor refugees in Canada tend to be from cultural and religious backgrounds that are similar to the people they sponsor. It creates weird things in Canada. I mean, a very large percentage of the Afghan refugees settled in Canada are Ismaili Shiites, which is a group that's maybe 1% of the Afghan population and is like more than a third of the Afghan refugees in Canada, because that's the community that sponsors refugees. Huge proportion of the Arabs in Canada are Christian, because most Arabs in Canada are Christian, so that's who sponsors them and so on. Germany, it doesn't work that way. The way it works is the state says we're going to distribute the refugees according to economic need across every municipality, and every municipality will get some, which is how you guys end up being in a place like Hemsbach, which you call a bedroom community. I think it partly is, but it's pretty rural as well, right? I mean, it's still kind of a rural town, if I understand. I spent a bunch of time in Gelnhausen, which is on the other side of Frankfurt, which is pretty rural, and they were trying to settle 1,000 refugees. They even built a mosque, which for a small town in that part of Germany, there was a real welcome culture. It's like, okay, here's finally some people to run our shops, to run this hotel that's largely been abandoned, so on. Meanwhile, the refugees, I mean, look, the Syrians actually are probably in theory not a bad fit, because the Syrians who come tend to be fairly high skilled, often with university degrees. A lot of them owned property and shops and so on. There's a filtering effect. To get your family across the Mediterranean in one of those rubber rafts costs about €3,000 per person in your family. So it's not dirt poor people coming out of some mud hut or something like that. It tends to be people, maybe not quite from the middle class of the countries that are coming, but people with some means and resources and ambitions. So it's not unrealistic to say, okay, these people seem to be a good fit for our needs in the economy. But there are problems with refugees that I think the mayors of these towns and cities are only starting to recognize. There's sort of the basic paradox of the refugee, which is that a refugee is very different from a regular immigrant, and that a refugee wants, above all else, to no longer be a refugee. And that's your main goal. And there's two ways for that to happen. You can no longer be a refugee because you become an immigrant. I mean, all refugees at some level are also economic migrants. They want to have a job, a house, security for their family and for themselves. But the other way that you can stop being a refugee is to move back and have the crisis end, and so on. I mean, about 2/3 of the Balkan refugees, of the 3 million Balkan refugees in the 1990s who came to Germany, about 2/3 of them ended up moving back. Everyone thought that conflict would go on forever, for 100 years. It ended in 2000 quite successfully, and they moved back. And the Syrians think that way too, right? There's what people in migration studies call the myth of return, the belief that you're there temporarily, you're going to move back. And that's a bit dangerous for people, because people don't settle as well if they think they're just camped out and they're going to be there temporarily and they're going to move back. And I think that's going to be a thing that's going to be confronted in the next few months in many of the big cities of Germany. And the other thing that's going to be confronted is the fact that, if I understand correctly, the German officials expect about 30% of these migrants to be recognized as legal refugees under the UN Convention. 30% is a very high ratio by European standards, actually, but it means that 70%, so many hundreds of thousands of people, are not going to be accepted, will theoretically be destined for deportation, which in the case of some people will be inconvenient, in cases of other people will be really devastating. And the problem is that there's no coordinated system, right? You can move around the Schengen zone pretty easily, and there's no sort of agreement as to what country is going to send people back. So you get a lot of these unaccompanied men from countries that you'd never really be recognized as a refugee. And the people who don't get accepted tend to be unaccompanied men who are knocking around Europe, and they kind of give a bad name to the legitimate refugees. You get a lot of resentment between people. Anyway, that's the background, and I think there's going to be a difficult situation next year where the ambitions of the mayors, and let's be honest, many of these mayors are doing this not because of an honest desire to fill labor shortages and so on, but because the federal republic is spending a huge sum of money to build 700,000 units of housing in a very short period of time, right? Billions and billions of euros. At a time when no other governments in Europe are building social housing, they're building 700,000 euros. They had an emergency meeting in September of the ministers to rewrite the German building code to lower the minimum standard of housing so that they could build houses that are below the old legal standard. Still probably a higher standard of housing than we have in Canada, but in order to do that. 700,000 units of housing is a huge amount of money. There are certainly people, you get small cities in Brandenburg and Saxony and places with no economy that are asking for 10,000 refugees really just so they can get some housing money. And you wonder what these refugees are going to do in a place with no economy, right? I mean, at least the guys you're working with were in a region with a pretty robust economy. And so on, although it's a rural town like that, it's kind of a picture. Anyway, that's the background. So does that square with what you're seeing?
Yeah, for sure. A couple of things. It's interesting because these guys are all only so-called economic migrants. There's no legitimate refugees there to welcome. They don't seem to care. The townspeople don't seem to care. They're welcoming these, particularly, in fact, it's the Gambian guys that have gotten the most sort of sympathy. In fact, some of the Kosovo guys are resentful as to how the Gambian guys are getting treated because the Kosovos come in families and they're kind of harder for people to welcome and adopt. And so the Gambian guys are being adopted. Would you agree that, I mean, we heard that, yeah?
I mean, it's also that, like, Gambians guys, like, they came individually, and in that way, like, they're forced to socialize with people, and versus, like, family, like, they're just, like, stayed together and they just talk among themselves. Like, when we were there, we also realized, like, Gambian guys are all, like, very, like, I guess, social, like, everyone's talking to each other and everyone going to different rooms and then, like, I guess, like, chilling. And then, like, you go downstairs, it's like, quite, like, different feel, like, everyone's, like, in their room, and then it's just, like, kids running around.
Yeah, I mean, the Kosovars and Macedonians and people like that from the southern former Yugoslavia, there's also a bit of a different attitude, I think partly because there was that huge wave Kosovars and Bosnians and people like that in the 1990s. And Germany and its NATO allies, like Canada, underwent a fairly complicated decade stabilizing Kosovo, making it what is recognized by most countries as an independent country, and all that. And there's sort of a consensus agreement that there is no more need for refugees from Kosovo. So nobody walking up across Serbia from Kosovo is going to be recognized as a refugee, and they kind of all know that. And it's a bit more of an ambiguous situation. The African migrants are interesting in that they're also not going to be recognized. I mean, there's a large number of Nigerians, people like that, who are not going to be recognized as migrants, even though they come from a tough place. And look, okay, let me spell this out. If you come from Nigeria and you've made it to Germany, okay, you're not a refugee, you've not come from a war zone, but here's what's happened. You've come from some place in Nigeria, you're probably not dirt poor or anything, because you have connections, you have SMS messages with people you know from Nigeria in Europe. Like you're going to be reasonably well connected to take the risk of doing this. But it means you've saved up a bit of money, and you've made the crossing across the Sahara, across several countries, some of which are in bad conflict situations, possibly by foot or by some combination of vehicles, to Tripoli, because that's where you go. Just the trip from there to Tripoli is probably going to put you in some bad situations along the way. You get to Tripoli, where things are very bad in Tripoli. You're going to have to hang out possibly for a year, possibly for 2 years, to do enough work to save up enough money to get on the boat. Black Africans are not treated very well in Libya right now, to put it very mildly. You probably had a very bad time doing the lowest level of work, being treated badly, being harassed by various officials and non-officials in Tripoli, and then paid a bunch of money to get on a rubber raft that has about a 1 in 5 chance of dying. There's also a very good chance that you've had to do that more than once, paid like 3,000 euro to get on a rubber raft, because a huge percentage of them end up getting stopped by officials, or half sinking and then coming back, and that sort of thing. And then you're going to get roughed up by officials, possibly put in a Libyan jail for a while, and then have to start the whole process again. And then you're going to make this horrible crossing, which is physically devastating even when it's successful. You're going to wash ashore in Lampedusa, you're going to get roughed up by Italian authorities and have a really bad experience there. And then somehow you're going to make the crossing to a city in Germany. So by the time you've made it from Nigeria to Germany, you have undergone as traumatic and violent an experience as anybody fleeing a war in Syria and so on. So it's why the distinction, the legal and policy distinction between refugees and economic migrants, it exists for a reason, because they're two very different regimes and conditions. But the actual human experience of somebody entering Germany from those two backgrounds is not going to be very different. You're going to have had a very traumatic experience. You're going to have made a huge risk based on a large investment, and you're going to be coming from a very similar headspace.
Yeah, I mean, that was the sense I think we both had, that the Gambian guys, many of them seemed, I don't know, you described it as you.
They were big.
Well, they were big, but they were stressed too.
Yeah.
You said you felt that some of them had, it was just your guess that some of them had been through something you described as warlike, just because of the kind of degree of stress that they were.
The Gambia is not exactly the most together place.
Yeah, for sure. So, but one of the deals was we don't ask any questions about their backgrounds or about their trip over unless they volunteer them, and we didn't want to go there just out of respect, because they're sorting. They have to state their story to the officials and get it checked for its veracity as a story of refuginess. So
yeah,
messing around with that. They don't know us. They don't know exactly who we are.
I mean, and you probably found this. You have to be honest. In any group of people who are migrants and refugees, you also get people in the group who are like hardcore criminals. You get people with severe psychological problems. Maybe you didn't start out with them. You know, maybe they gained those psychological problems through the harrowing process, or maybe they're just people who were wandering and joined the group and that sort of thing, right? I mean, you get a mixed bag of people. It's very bad, as some of the media do, to characterize this as a group of dangerous criminal extremist people, because they're very much not. But on the other hand, it's a random group of people who wandered into Europe. So you also get people, and this is much more of a problem for the refugees and migrants, particularly those with families, than it is for the general population, because they are at risk from the people they're stuck with and around them, as you said. Now, you have to remember, when it was mainly Germans in refugee camps after the war, when it was IDP camps, there was all sorts of those problems as well. There were crazy people, there were criminals, there were violent people preying on people. If you read the newspaper articles from those days, the refugee camps with Europeans in them were just as violent and risky and dangerous as the ones with Africans and Middle Eastern people in them and so on. It's just the nature of displaced people camps.
I'm curious if you've seen any, in all of your travels, any projects that, not that they might be similar, but are using atypical or innovative ways to answer a question like employment. Are people, I mean, there's this sort of immediate triage of taking care of these people's, roofs on their head and stuffed animals for the kids and all of that kind of books for everybody, that initial outpouring. But the question of the next phase, is that something you're seeing at all?
This has been a big transformation in Germany, and which is an understanding that refugees, or potential refugees, are people who ought to be put into the employment system. Until very recently, refugees were not allowed to seek employment in Germany. That was a big change quite recently. And some countries still don't allow it. Sweden doesn't allow refugees to seek employment. Certainly not until they've learned the language, and I mean, people don't tend to learn the language. So Sweden has this problem that its refugees, which is a large proportion of its migration, they end up locked outside of the labor force, and they end up hanging out at the shopping mall or at the public square, something like that, and they give a bad image to migrants and that sort of thing. And this was a problem in Germany before as well, in that because people were locked out of the economy, you don't integrate, right? I mean, the work I'm doing with the World Bank, which is basically to catalog what are the obstacles to integration for what in World Bank language is urban labor, migrant labor force integration. We're looking at what resources migrants to cities need to get started, to start a small business, to acquire housing, to get linked into the education system, into the political system, to become integrated, particularly educationally and economically, because our argument is that once people are integrated economically and educationally, the cultural stuff just tends to follow from that naturally. And if you don't get the economic and educational integration, then no amount of language training or anything is going to help. And we're looking at the obstacles that get in the way of those things. And we found that, I think it's safe to say that as far as integration of refugees, the most effective process that we found as far as best practices in European countries is to turn them into economic migrants as quickly as you can. To essentially get them into a position where they can seek work, allow them to join clusters of other migrants from the same cultural and linguistic background. Because people tend to integrate better when they can be in tight-knit physical areas where they can loan each other money and live together and help each other learn the language and that sort of thing. Scattering people remotely across this countryside is not a great vehicle for integration. This is a big debate in Germany, right? There's a lingering belief because of the Gastarbeiter experience, the Turkish migrant experience, that having migrants from one background all living in one place is creating a parallel society or a ghetto, right? That failed integration happens, which is completely contradictory to the Canadian or United States or British experience, which is that when immigrants are allowed to form neighborhoods of people from the same background and culture and so on, that helps integration. Their kids are going to learn the language quicker, they're going to end up in university and that sort of thing. And this is a big rumbling debate that is very much unresolved in Germany. I'd say it's a more sophisticated debate in Germany than many other European countries, which are still avoiding this debate, but whether you should scatter people across the countryside or allow them to form districts. The fact is, even if you take the current German approach, which is to spread them everywhere, they're going to end up, sooner or later, in the big cities, living near people from the same background. In Canada, we know this. In Canada, we have refugees who do settle in every province. But of the refugees who settle in, let's say, in the Maritimes and in Saskatchewan and places like that, 50% of them end up moving to Ontario or Quebec. Probably that means to Toronto or Montreal, or to Vancouver. Because, and of those who settle in Ontario or Quebec, 90% of them end up staying put. Because it makes sense to be around people like you. And I just had a meeting with the mayor of Neukölln, which is the Berlin district that, famous as a poor migrant district, controversial as a poor migrant district, much better place than it was 10 years ago when it had crime problems and extremism problems and that sort of thing, but still, poor migrant district. It's not being assigned any refugees. There, I mean, places like Mannheim and Neukölln and Kreuzberg in Berlin are not officially being given any refugees because they're full, as the language says. They have more, their school system has more people who don't speak German than it can handle, they're full. But the mayor of Neukölln, as she said to me, we're going to get them. They're going to come. Are they going to try to settle 1,000 refugees in coach bus? You know, an East German city with no economy, tons of abandoned houses, neo-Nazi gangs, and street crime and that sort of thing. They're not going to hang out there very long. There are a lot of places, there are a lot of cities where the mayors think that they have an abandoned American army base from when the Americans pulled out 10 years ago. Why don't we just fill it with refugees?
Doing that in Heidelberg.
In Heidelberg, it might actually make some sense, because that military base is actually fairly, it's in a good location. It's quite nice. The Americans had nice housing for their soldiers, to be said. But there's other places where you see this abandoned military base in the middle of a field somewhere, and you think, okay, what are these people going to do? Even if they open up like a shop or a falafel restaurant, there's not going to be any customers walking past or anything like that. So she was saying, we're going to get them. Our school system within a year is going to have Syrians in it, and we're prepared for that because we actually, those places like Mannheim or Neukölln have actually spent years re-engineering their school systems to be good at teaching mixed classes with different linguistic levels, with more than, they have more than one teacher per classroom and things like that. So they're probably better prepared educationally, social services, skills training, all those things to handle them. And I wonder, Hemsbach sounds very interesting because it sounds like there's a great municipal enthusiasm, that welcome culture. That's the contradictory thing to what I was pointing out, is that some of these smaller places have a real desire and a surprising openness to people of different cultures and backgrounds.
And it's definitely clear from what people have said, part of it is historical, and righting historical wrongs and trying to make up for one of the sort of key people in Hemsbach cites a relative who is SS, and that's part of the motivation, as well as the understanding of the refugee, what a refugee situation really is from the same sort of era. I'm wondering, should we open up the questions?
Yeah. I think it's a wider dialogue.
Questions or comments, or if anybody has anything to contribute in terms of other initiatives that they've heard of that are in the same ballpark, or?
I have a question for Doug. My husband's from Amsterdam, and we lived there for a couple of years. And we ended up moving into a neighborhood that was almost completely Moroccan. And we took that place because it was a brand new apartment, and they were trying to integrate, to mix the people together, and it was sort of a city project to put people together of different socioeconomic backgrounds, to try and break up the traditional Moroccan.
Was it Western Amsterdam?
And Eastern.
Okay.
And anyway, but it really didn't work, and it was terrifying, and we moved back here. And so I just wondered, like, is that Moroccan thing in Amsterdam, where more than 50% of Amsterdammers claim Arabic as their first language on census. Like, they have the same challenge as in Germany with the Turks, a high concentration of people from one culture, and that it just doesn't mix. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how the Germans are trying to tackle mixing immigrants to avoid the ghetto scenario.
Well, as I said, this is the big debate. Does concentration help integration, or does it create parallel societies? So, and the Moroccans in the Netherlands, I mean, are an interesting case because they've had a hard time. I'd say it's getting better. The Turks have done much better, partly because the Turks have helped each other out. The Turks were hugely controversial 20, 30 years ago. They were regarded as integration failures. You know, their education levels were well below other groups. Now in Germany, this was exaggerated because they had no pathway to citizenship. So, right, so if you can't buy your house or start a legal business or put your kids in university, you're going to have trouble integrating. Turks in the Netherlands and Belgium and Britain actually did quite well, and within two or three generations are now entering university and that sort of thing. But the Moroccans have had a hard time for a couple of reasons. First of all, because they come from the Rif Mountains, which is, look, the reason why there's so many Moroccans in the Benelux region is because there was a deal struck in the 1950s between government of Belgium and the King of Morocco, because they had huge labor shortages, right? During those golden years in the 1950s, they needed just hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people to staff the factories. And the King of Morocco said, yeah, you can have some people. Let's get these people from the Rif Mountains who actually have just led a guerrilla insurgency to try to overthrow me. And it would be really nice to kick them out of Morocco. They're mainly Berbers, goat farmers, very, very remote region, who arrived without speaking French, certainly not Dutch or Flemish, and without really speaking Arabic that anybody would recognize as Arabic. So very deprived background, entering an industrial economy that then fairly soon after they arrived, that industrial economy ceased to exist, right? It shifted to a post-industrial economy. And they were living in places, immigrants who settled in the central cities managed to do all right when with the shift after about a 20-year period of social strife. The Bangladeshis in Britain have done extremely well, better than anyone. The Turks in Germany are now doing pretty well after a 20-year period of troubles and so on. The Moroccans, and partly because they could start up shops, they tended to buy property and so on. The Moroccans were stuck in apartment complexes on the edge of town, very much. So they had this housing isolation where they couldn't buy their housing, they couldn't start a shop. The co-op housing structure of the Netherlands was somewhat detrimental as well. They had big housing complexes with big empty areas between them and that so on. And they ended up isolated. And a lot of those places became very scary. And in fact, the people most harmed by that were often the Moroccans themselves, who found they couldn't leave their houses, there were criminal gangs, there was all sorts of trouble in those neighborhoods. One of those neighborhoods on the western side, that's why I asked, was the one that produced that young man who stabbed the filmmaker Theo van Gogh to death and created a political crisis that lasted for a decade, caused really scary extremists to become politically successful in the Netherlands, and that sort of thing, and it just finally has started dying down now. And finally the Netherlands is starting to do the things that's needed to be done. I mean, to create higher density housing, to do those sort of experiments which are working in some places in art. And finally you're starting to get some of the educational outcomes in the second and third generation of Moroccans. But it's partly because, yeah, they just dumped a lot of people from the most deprived background with nebulous pathway to citizenship.
It's a different process in like Brussels, and like Molenbeek is a particularly interesting and vibrant neighborhood, and that's.
Well, Molenbeek is an example of which is the area in Brussels that was a no-go zone, failed integration, parallel society, ghetto. Even 10 years ago, that was widely said about it. And now it's a really exciting place. And it's still very Moroccan. It's also very sub-Saharan African, right? It's Molenbeek where these African guys from, not just from Congo, which is the big place because it was a Belgian colony, but from all over sub-Saharan Africa, run these enterprises where they buy up all the cars of Western Europe that people don't want anymore, fix them up, and put them on ships to Africa. Basically, if you're anywhere in West Africa and you see a European car, it's come through Molenbeek. Like 500,000 cars a year get shipped through there, to the point that some of these African guys have bought entire shipping companies and blocks of houses and so on. And the Moroccans are starting to do fairly well too. Probably because they improved. I mean, this is with the work I'm doing with the World Bank, so it's self-promotional for me to say this, but they did smart things in Molenbeek. They put in high-speed transportation. They put in schools that weren't just up to the average of European cities, but were well above the average, right? So that middle-class kids were competing against the migrants to get into the schools in that district. They put in a lot of skills training. They built whole hotels there that were designed actually, it's an example of what you're doing from the artistic angle that they did in Molenbeek, which they built a huge hotel, which is entirely a skills training hotel, designed to teach accounting skills, management skills, hospitality skills to these people from deprived migrant backgrounds, so that yeah, you can book a room there through hotels.com or whatever, but everyone working for you is trained. It's like when it's like your kids getting haircuts.
Yes.
My wife got one of the most interesting haircuts in her life in Hackney. A number of years ago, from one of the kids through one of your earlier interventions. Just an aside.
What's the name of the hotel?
I can find it out for you.
And is it? And it's.
There's a thing like that here in Toronto at Thorncliffe Park. There's a training supermarket,
right,
which is entirely designed to teach, accounting skills, inventory skills, business management skills.
Yeah, Thorncliffe Park is a sort of an inspiration for a lot of the stuff like this. What they're doing there is, and what they've been doing there for years, the different approaches.
The Thorncliffe has huge. I mean, look, this is not always an easy process, right? Thorncliffe is a successful place because it tends to produce huge amounts of social mobility. The children of people from it tend to do very well educationally and so on. It still has huge social tensions, battles between different factions and so on, crime problems. It has 1/3 of its students didn't go to school and probably still aren't in school because their parents were protesting sex education and that sort of thing, right? So, I mean, the bottom rung on the migration ladder is a very difficult rung, even when it's very successful. Most migrants don't learn the language, which is why their children always do, 100%. It's never a problem unless you have some really weird situation, like if they don't have any pathway to citizenship or something like that, and their parents are assuming they're. This is why refugees are trickier. Refugees are going to be inclined not to teach their kids the language because they think they're going to be going back.
Well, although the Ghanaians, while interested in refugee status and applying for refugee status, I don't think they have any. They're no interest in going back. They want to live in Europe instead.
Yeah, and that helps actually. The Turks had a huge problem in Germany because they thought they were going back. Right? I mean, the reason why the guest workers, the Turkish guest workers, 2 million of them, stayed in Germany wasn't because they wanted to stay and were trying to stick around and collect benefits or something like that. It's because the employers wanted to keep them on. They worked for the legal 2 years in a transistor factory or a Volkswagen factory or something like that, and even in an unskilled job, it takes about 8 months for you to get up to even reasonable speed and competency. And the companies were like, well, why do we have to send these guys back? And so they kept keeping them on longer and longer. Canada needs to learn a lesson of this with its temporary foreign worker program. There really is very little thing as a temporary worker. This temporary mindset. And the Turks, because they had no pathway to citizenship, developed this temporary mindset. they did all their investments and small businesses. Okay, just to close it, I mean, I wrote about this a couple years ago. The man who should be remembered as the Ray Kroc of Europe, the greatest fast food entrepreneur in Europe, died 2 years ago in Berlin. Because he was the guy who invented the doner kebab, which is the most popular fast food in Europe and possibly in the Western world, right? So Ray Kroc, everyone knows he was the founder of McDonald's, became a household name, died a billionaire, and that sort of thing. The guy who invented the doner kebab, nobody knows his name. He died penniless, living with relatives in a house. Why? Because he had no pathway to citizenship. He was a gastarbeiter. He could not turn his business into a legal business. He could not get a patent on his invention. He could not invest any money in his country. He invested some of it in Turkey because he had to. He could not put his kids in school. He could not buy a house. Any of these sort of things, all because of that. So an opportunity to create, an opportunity to turn a poor migrant into the greatest fast food entrepreneur of Europe was lost because of lack of a pathway to citizenship and integration. So that's the type of, I mean, that's why I'm interested in your intervention. You're actually doing the things that policymakers are doing from an artistic perspective.
I'm always stuck a bit between that dichotomy of what you just described, Doug, as getting out of that not helpful temporary mindset that you described, but on the other hand, especially when you're working with refugees with a completely precarious situation psychologically, legally, socially, to sort of respect potential outcomes and be realistic about that. I mean, you started out about saying, of course, some people will always say Darren O'Donnell is a very naive kind of guy, you know, or maybe he's just a sort of a utopian guy. But how do you deal with, for yourself also, in terms of having integrity and responsibility for these people that entrust their stories to you, that are performers with you? In a way, what is your plan B? What if these guys, that guy is not there when you come back to Hemsbach?
I mean, one of the kind of fails.
And then he had a great party. And he's like, hey, I had a couple of great parties with Darren O'Donnell. That's awesome. And now I'm back in freaking Gambia,
yeah.
right?
Well,
so how do you deal with that?
And I think you can talk about that more. The reason why I wanted chosen along is because of a little bit of a familiarity with this kind of situation, but he proved out to be much more valuable to me because he was able to hang around with these guys much more easily. He was much more part of the crew. But from your experience, and this was the fail-safe, is that they don't actually think we're going to be successful. They don't think we can help them.
Yeah, that's
really?
Yeah, they're just like, oh, these funny guys from Canada who are kind of fun to hang around with.
They don't have huge expectations. No. You're not raising this level of expectation of.
I would describe
I'm going to be a dentist tomorrow in Germany, which they won't.
No.
Let's face it. You know.
Even if they have a dentistry degree.
Exactly.
Even if that, yeah. But
nor will they be
what's your experience?
I think that's something we were saying before. Like they're used to seeing like these artists like come and go. So like they just think like we're something that's happening short term and they're just gonna go away forever.
They see a lot of come and go, and lots of people come and observe and get to meet them, and officials come through all the time. I don't think anybody's even sure of what it all means and the implications of it, or what are the effects of this in short term, long term. Who is this guy? What is this art thing that's coming to town? They, like I said, one of them played Siegfried in the Nibelungen, the guy from Cape Verde. What's that dude's name? Fernando. Yeah, Fernando played Siegfried, and so I don't think he has any great notion he's going to be a movie star or anything like that. But I think nobody really knows what's going to happen, but nobody thinks much is going to happen. That made me feel okay, like I was a little bit like and I'm really clear. I don't know what I'm doing here. I have no idea. I'm not an expert at employment at all. I'm just here because here's some extra labor to try to answer this question. But it doesn't seem like anybody's hopes are getting up. And we hang out with them, and we made sure that there was, during this any kind of cultural events we get money from the culture office, and we can pay for the transit and tickets to see some opera and stuff like that. So we're having a good time, and they're bored and they have no job. So it's sometimes it's better than nothing. Sometimes clearly they want to go home and they're tired of watching opera. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Michael. I'm from Germany. I have been living here in Toronto for 2 months now, and I've been working with refugees. Well, actually, I was working for the Bauhaus Nauenstraße in Berlin, which is a theater, and it's funded by a woman from Turkey. I mean, she was an immigrant, Shermin Langhoff, in 2008. 5 years ago, and it got very successful. And what we did was we made, now that Wagner Cavallo, he's Afro-Brazilian, and he's the artistic director now, and we have been doing a film video project for black people. It was about black perspectives, and it was in Kreuzberg, and near the place, near the theater, there was a refugee camp. They were fighting for the right to move freely. So that would be one question of mine. So what were they thinking? Oh, did they have to stay in Hemsbach, or could they move?
That's finished now. They don't do that anymore. Before they would have to stay in their state, and they were quite restricted.
Right.
Now they're free to move around. So they spend the weekends away. They've got full social lives. They're hanging out. They got girlfriends. They got German girlfriends.
Right. That would be my question.
Yeah.
Where did they go, or if they could move, where would they go? Would they go to Frankfurt or to Berlin?
I mean, they have a place to sleep there. They have a bed. They have an allowance that comes to them. So I think they're staying there, but they're not. They go to Mannheim to out to discos and parties and stuff like that, and come in the train at 7 in the morning, and you know. So they're living kind of relatively normal lives. They don't have those restrictions. I think those restrictions, I remember those in 2012 still being in place, so they're relatively recently gone.
Yeah, yeah. So because I think it's a very important aspect that they can be active themselves.
What? Sorry, can you tell me what's the name and where is that theater?
The theater is in Berlin.
Okay.
And it's called Bauhaus Nauenstraße.
Bauhaus Nauenstraße.
Naunin, yeah. Naunin is N-A-U-N-Y-N. And that's street. Yeah.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm trying to put my head around this whole refugee experience. So if they're in Hemsbach, and I learned a little bit more by your conversation that was going on, that they can move around and go to different cities, so they're not just there. But do the Germans themselves know what they're going to do with, it sounds like these people are just there in limbo, and where are they, like, are they going to stay in Germany, or are they, you know, like, does anyone know what's going to happen to these people? It just seems like a bizarre situation to be in.
Well, we know, like, probably what's going to happen, like, kind of at an aggregate level, which is, like Doug mentioned, 30% will get settled and will stay, and their refugee claim will be accepted. They're from Syria, where there's clear danger for them. Then those from Gambia, Nigeria, the Balkans, they're probably going back. So that 70% will probably go back. That we know. But then there's a lot of, most people sort of don't know when that will happen, or what's supposed to be happening in the meantime, and what should we do with this tiny, and if you saw it, it's a tiny place, like 10,000 people. There's other towns, and Weinheim, which is a sort of larger city that's, you know, a 15-minute bus ride, so it doesn't feel like we're in a rural, it really does feel like this bedroom community to these other places. But yeah, nobody really knows.
So these people's lives are really in limbo because of the political situation.
Well, I think because of the backlog, nobody's too sure when they'll be processed. They had to be processed in a certain amount of time, 3 months or something. Now, they're not sure, nobody's sure when. And by processed, I mean you tell your story to the people at Karlsruhe, which is like the state capital, and they ask you all these questions. We've got copies of the questions. There's 42 questions, and then they can ask subsequent questions. They try to trip you up. They try to, you know, they ask you all these questions to make sure your story is watertight and it sounds like you've got. And I think the maybe one way for refugee status from African countries is to claim homophobia and persecution on that. But like I said, I didn't ask I don't know what any of them are claiming. I didn't get into them.
But it seems if you've come that far and gone through all those risks to get there, and then to just say turn you around and say you have to go back to where you came from, That just seems
It's
like-
worse than that because you can't actually go back to where Europe is not allowed to deport people to the country they say they came from. It's under what are called anti-refoulement laws, which means that
So where would a Gambian guy get?
this has not been worked out properly yet. There was an attempt to create a unified European system for deportation of non-accepted refugees 10 years ago, 11 years ago, and there was never any agreement between the countries in it, whose responsibility it was, and all that. Further compounding this is the fact that if you get on one of those boats, and I've hung out in Libya and Tunisia and Egypt with the people getting on the boat, the first thing you're told is to rip up and destroy any ID papers you have, to create ambiguity about your place of origin and return.
Because limbo is better than deportation.
For
That's
some
what they're
people,
going
for some people.
Yeah.
Some people just want to work for a couple of years and go send the money back and bring the money back. They probably would have been happy a few years ago, well, happy before Maastricht when there were seasonal visas available in Southern European countries, that sort of thing. I mean, the elimination of the easy movement back and forth to Africa, free movement, right? You just take a flight, work for a year, fly back. That was easy. The elimination of that easy movement back and forth has created this dangerous, illegal, extremely risky boat trade. That Mediterranean boat trade started in about 2002, 2003. It didn't exist before that, and it only came into existence because of the elimination of seasonal visas in Southern European countries. Right? This could easily be solved by creating a legal pathway. Spain solved its migrant problem by creating legal pathways and negotiating arrangements with sending countries. So there's a need to sort of step above this and say, okay, the people who aren't refugees, because the people who are refugees are different. Most of them will return at some point and all that. But the people who aren't refugees, that's who you're dealing with, and they are afloat. And look, they're part of a reality of migration around the world, which is that when an economy is strong and it has labor shortages, people will migrate. They'll come, no matter what your immigration policy is. The largest flows of immigrants into Germany and Britain occurred 2 or 3 years after all immigration was legally ended, right? Britain saw something like 4 times as many immigrants during the 10-year period after it ended all immigration in the 1970s than during the 10-year period before that. Same with Germany. Germany saw more immigration in the 1970s than it saw in the 1960s, even though it officially had 0 immigration. Why? Because the economy needed people. And when the economy doesn't need people, it doesn't get people. None of these people are going to Portugal, right? Portugal has lots of empty houses. It's a nice sunny place to live. It's close to the countries where people come from. They actually have policies. They want immigrants because they don't have good people. But they don't have an economy, so nobody migrates to Portugal. During the 2 years after the 2008 economic crisis, there was a net outflow of migrants from the European Union back into Turkey and North Africa. There was a net outflow of migrants from the United States back into Central America, by the millions and millions in both cases. Why? Because when the economy turns down, people move outward. So in many ways, it's tough to talk about people as being units of labor. You don't really want to talk about people that way. These are all human situations. On the other hand, people show up when there is economic opportunity. Nobody takes the risk of migration or even a flight without having it, because it's expensive and difficult and hard on your family and all that, unless you have a fairly sure sense, not 100%, but a reasonable gamble that there's some economic opportunity for you, that there's a housing opportunity for you, and that there are people who at least you can relate to from similar backgrounds near you. And that's the place where you'll finally settle. And a lot of that is what we're seeing.
So as these people are being, so I guess the word is housed, is the German government giving them like opportunities to learn the language?
Yeah, there's that, yeah. And the city's putting a lot of effort into that and putting a lot of resources into that. There's regular language courses. It was weekly during the summer, but they've ramped it up. I think they're doing 3 days a week. They're going to school.
Yes, now it's part of the official mandate of the Goethe-Institut, to the point where the Goethe-Institut, which I didn't know for the longest time, I saw it on German television, does training, language training on the Syrian border. Like my colleagues in Turkey, from our institutes in Turkey, in Ankara and Istanbul, send teachers to the camps. They go into Kurdistan, into the camps, in tents. They teach them German because they know exactly where they're going to go.
There's a huge shortage of teachers of German
Yes,
as a second language. There's thousands of German language teachers being employed at the moment.
How are these guys with the language? I mean, I found in places like Frankfurt and Hamburg, I'd see guys from English and French-speaking African countries who managed to learn German pretty quickly, given that there were no German colonies in Africa, right? So
there's definitely a handful of them that are taking it super seriously and are getting up to speed. There's some that don't really seem to care too much.
And like I sort of found out about their like education background. So most of them are just stop learning after like secondary school. And then it's weird. Like they expect these old 30 whatever guys to go back to school, like younger guys, and then they expect to learn German.
Yeah, it's tough. But they're working hard. You know, like,
yeah.
And they're doing all right. I want to mention one thing before we pass on to this. That's Yusuf. He's super friendly. This was only supposed to flash by every now and again. It's just him making a joke. I just want to be that clear. He's this great guy. We're stuck on him giving everybody the fingers. A total accident. You didn't notice it? Yeah, I didn't notice that when I put it in. I apologize. He's hilarious.
His buddy looks a little more menacing.
That's from Albania.
Yeah.
It's the Albanian flag. Yeah.
It's interesting you brought up Albania because the Prime Minister, President of Albania, is a former artist who uses artists in the development planning. Yeah, in a big time. Anyways, Doug, you mentioned that Germany is now using artists as policy makers, I guess, or initiative.
Well, it's become a standard thing for a lot of governments to do this.
It has, and so I'm just kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about you can talk about how your project fits into that scheme, and have you met other artists who are working with other migrants or refugees? Is there?
I haven't. That's not because that's not. I mean, yeah. My practice includes working with a lot of migrant populations, usually young people in other places, but I'm usually not in the kinds of venues where that's happening. I'm aware of people. There's Vulcan Claws. They're from Austria. They're really, really good. And I've heard that there's lots going on in Berlin, but no, I'm not really part of that. This is just sort of this, and I want to get to know more people and find out about other initiatives.
You know, the German Pavilion this year wasn't really. Part of the project was, I don't remember the artist's names, they published a newspaper where they interviewed young residents, I think, in Berlin. Some very, very interesting interviews about these young people coming to Berlin who said, you know, they never wanted to be a refugee. And there they were. Did you see it? Like, it was super interesting.
What pavilion?
At the German Pavilion at the Biennale this year. Okay. Half of it was devoted to this whole situation, and so I'm just kind of curious kind of how formalized this initiative is, and what, you know, what
these kinds of initiatives.
Yeah.
I mean, there's since kind of around since the 90s, there's been a movement toward making like socially engaged performance.
That I understand.
It just seems to be the next sort of step with that, or that those people are now rolling up their sleeves and getting involved in this.
But I mean, what's so unique and which struck me immediately about your work is that you're not doing work about refugees or at refugees. You're really, really trying to do it with them collaboratively in an open process, completely open-ended. We were just in Germany on an initiative in East Germany, just outside of Leipzig, which was an interesting experience. For one, we were displaced out of the hotel we were booked into because that had been confiscated, and 2,000 Syrians had been put in there. And part of the media arts project that we were involved in there had Berlin-based Swiss duo of, also interestingly too, Swiss gay artists that have been doing some work on actually the refugee, or rather non-refugee policy in Australia for us. And they kind of, like, the whole project was kind of overrun by the situation in Europe, and we asked them to present something in Halle, and they said, well, we can't just like put down a project that we did 6 months ago in Australia, we'll have to comment on this. What they did is they got one of those fairly big rubber dinghies, you might have seen one, I've never seen one myself, that they shipped it over from Crete. It was a real sort of refugee boat, and they put it in this installation space in this big media arts conference, and then invited the Syrians that were in my hotel, and I was in a different hotel. Although they tried to actually put us in the same hotel, that of course did not work, because officially the Mammalian team is a refugee camp now. It was all quite crazy, and then they invited these Syrian men who were kind of, I just told you that before, they were kind of like treating it as a bouncy castle, but meanwhile telling us that, yeah, this is exactly the kind of boat I was on like 5 weeks ago. And it was really hard to believe. It was a great project, but it wasn't quite as brilliant as yours in that they tried to bridge that just by inviting those guys to a media arts hipster party, which was very odd. To be there with a lot of very young Arabic men, and we couldn't communicate or just tried in French a bit and tried to do it by music. It ended up being a party. They ended up DJing through the artist's laptop. But again, what they didn't quite do, that it wasn't set up as that, they didn't all work with them. It was a project, a very good project about the refugee situation and a commentary on it, but it didn't, other than inviting them to the opening, didn't necessarily involve them.
I mean, this is partly a way of approaching policy on a municipal level. I mean, this is not really a state thing, or certainly not a federal thing. But it's also because this is the only thing anybody's talking about right now. It's the only issue in Germany right now. And it's not surprising that everything from the including the cultural arms of municipal administrations is getting engaged with this, because it really is the only issue, right from the chancellor's office down to every small town right now.
Now that you say that, sorry, another example that involves the Goethe-Institut is that our very awesome foreign minister, I have to say, who I increasingly fall in love with, just delivered a fantastic speech for the Goethe-Institut and talked about the importance of culture, arts and culture and language teaching in this current situation. And again, something I had to find out through him and didn't know before is that he was on a state visit to Lebanon a year ago maybe, and made sure that he took German artists, one being Albert Ostermeier, a really well-known dramatist who we've worked with here, who then was so impacted by what he experienced there and by the refugee situation he saw there, that he went back home and continued to do artistic work, again, around that. He wrote a book about the experience and worked on that. So,
I mean, this is also
sort of a Team Canada mission, just without just economics, industry guys. Our foreign minister takes along a dramatist.
It's not unusual, yeah. Also, this is the one European country that can afford to do this right now. And I don't need to tell anyone here this, but it's unusual. There are no other European countries where the federal government is building housing at all. Never mind 700,000 low-cost units of housing just for refugees. There are no other countries that can afford that level of, to take on that many people that can afford that are as full of well-funded foundations for artistic things and so on right now. I mean the state of the economy in many cities, they have surpluses. They have the ability to pay for that. They can do the interventions necessary to make integration work. Economically and in terms of institutions, I actually don't think there's going to be a lot of problem with this enormous social experiment of refugees. I think on the social and cultural side, I think it's going to start to run into some rocky problems next year. I think the welcome culture will still be there. I think there's going to be some frictions and some difficulties. But there are no other countries that can afford this right now.
When you talked beforehand, you actually had like a specific time when you think that problems would come, and can you explain that and why you predicted that time?
It's partly to do with what you are seeing at the hostel or dormitory where you're working. There are a lot of people who are in ambiguous status. Right now, the national debate is, should we let people across the border? Should we be inviting Turkey to join the EU in exchange for policing its border? Should we be, there's a huge cultural resistance to anything that challenges the free movement within the Schengen area, and it reminds people of the worst history of Europe and so on. So there's resistance to that, and it's all about that, letting people in or not. How do we settle people in emergency shelters? By the time the winter is over, there's going to be this next stage question of who's legitimate and who's not, who is going to get the housing, who's not, who is a refugee under the 1951 UN Convention, and who is not, what are the people who are not, who's going to get deported, how are we going to manage that? And that's going to be divisive and difficult. And also, there's going to be a lot of people moving into neighborhoods that are difficult. There's going to be a lot of people who've been settled in cities that don't have an economy. There's going to be a lot of people creating economies and so on in informal ways that, there'll be, I mean, it's next year when the actual reality of how do you settle these people set in. I think there's a lot more experience now. I think a lot of people, there's a lot of maturity that's come through handling the Turks. I mean, I think after 2000, when there's an understanding that, okay, you give citizenship to people, that's brought in maturity. Not everywhere. I was surprised to see the level of, the people in Munich welcoming refugees at train stations and so on. I cannot see the CSU party in Bavaria being very interested in keeping that welcome culture going throughout next year and that sort of thing. You're already seeing frictions within CDU, CSU politics and so on. And
do you have any concerns about the rise of Pico? How do you say that? Pegida?
Pegida is in Dresden. It's a couple thousand people in the Dresden area, maybe a few in Leipzig. It's a protest movement in a couple cities, not even across Saxony and Brandenburg or anything like that, to say nothing of being a national movement or anything like that. It's a municipal protest movement, and it has to do with the politics of the former GDR and so on, with the economic realities there and that sort of thing. I worry much more about France, where almost 1/5 of all French citizens in the last presidential election voted for a presidential candidate whose only platform was opposition to Jews and Muslims and Roma. Right? That would never happen. That said, there'll be frictions and that sort of thing. But that type of right-wing xenophobic politics, it does not exist in any significant level on the lander level. It does not exist at all on the federal level. It exists in some cities, mostly in the most deprived parts of the country. I think the frictions aren't going to be in the form of extremist political parties. I think they're going to be in the form of mainstream difficulties and tensions within the existing political system.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. And feel free to talk to me on the way.